Welcome back, welcome back. Well, it doesn't happen often, but last weekend the usually tolerant Swiss surprised Europe by voting to ban the building of minarets on mosques. With 4 languages and a complex constitution, the Swiss have long used referendums, sometimes called referenda by people who don't know their Latin, to settle matters of national importance. But this time the result raises the question, is direct democracy the best way of representing a country's citizens? Or is it simply a step towards mob rule? Well, to hear both sides of the debate, I'm joined now by Peter Kellner, the president of the YouGov opinion polling organisation. Welcome, Peter. And by Shane Greer, executive editor of Total Politics magazine. Welcome, Shane. Now, this particular thing in Switzerland, this vote last weekend, I mean, it hasn't shaken your faith in referendums.
It hasn't. I think the Swiss example is, in some senses, quite extreme because they use referendums to a much greater extent than I think we ever would use here. And it's not a case of saying that we should use referendums for everything. I mean, we wouldn't be using referendums to take every single decision that the politicians, MPs, lords could be taking. But there are, I think, specific instances where it's very important to have referendums when there's an issue of national importance. For example, in the UK, I'll give you an example of a debate that's going on at the moment. In Scotland, should Scotland be an independent country? Should it leave the UK? That's clearly a decision that should be taken through a referendum because it's a decision that directly affects every single person in Scotland to such an extent that they have a fundamental right to exercise their democratic right to make that decision.
Directly, rather than...
directly, that's not a decision...
Not waiting for the next election. Or
Absolutely. That is not a decision that should be made by politicians. That is a decision that should be deferred to the electorate at large. Now, should the society as a whole, individuals as a whole, should they be making every decision? No. But there are very clear circumstances, and I think quite a few, where direct democracy, referendums, whether at a local or national level, are a very, very good thing.
Thank you, Shane. Peter, you do not agree?
I don't, David. My company, YouGov, we're testing public opinion the whole time. And the New York Times, some years ago, talked about public opinion as the world's second superpower. And so therefore, in a sense, it's all flattering, the idea of, we're agents of the concept of direct democracy by conducting opinion polls. But when I come to really look at it in detail, I think referendums do more harm than good. British democracy evolved over hundreds of years without ever there being referendum. Shane talks about Switzerland, but to take a constitutional issue whether Swiss had a referendum or had referendums was on whether women should have the vote. Switzerland was the last country in the Western world to give women the vote because men blocked it time and time again through referendums. That was an example of a group being discriminated against, just as Muslims are now. And so, in an ideal, I think the Germans got it right. They, after the war, they looked back at the plebiscites that Hitler held and said, we won't go down that path. The German constitution says no referendums. They got it right.
What I would say there, that when we look at this, as I said, I think it is quite an extreme example. They use referendums to a much greater degree than we would use ourselves. And the example you gave is a good one. But let's move back to Scotland. The SNP, the party in power in Scotland at the moment, they're very much in favour of having Scotland as an independent country leaving the United Kingdom. However, if we look at some of the opinion polling, and certainly, Peter, you could talk better to this than I could, the proportion of the Scottish people who are actually vehemently favour of full Scottish independence in the way the governing party is much, much, much lower. There's an example where the people have to make the decision, not the politicians.
What about in a situation like if you take the death penalty, which liberal opinion is passionately against, but maybe grassroots opinion isn't? I mean, do you think that if we had a referendum on the death penalty in this country, it would be reintroduced?
I think there's a chance that it may be reintroduced. It's very difficult to do. I mean, I haven't looked at any sort of opinion polling on that issue. I would imagine a lot of people are in favour of it. But the question is that something we would have a referendum on? Is that an issue that goes so much to the heart of life in the United Kingdom that we need to have a referendum? I'm not sure that it is. But if it is, then certainly it's something that we should have a referendum on, and people should be allowed to have their say. It's not a case of referendums replacing direct democracy. It's acknowledging the inherent weaknesses in direct democracy, both at a national, international and local level, and where that weakness can be basically bolstered, made better, reinforced through basically direct elections, referendums from the people.
Peter.
I think the problem here, Shane, whether you talk about Scottish independence or capital punishment, they sound like simple yes or no issues. They're not. I mean, take Scottish independence. What does that really mean? Would Scotland be part of the European Union? Would it have its own armed forces? Would it have its own currency? Would the Queen still be head of state? In other words, there isn't just independence or part of the United Kingdom. There are all sorts of gradations. Now,
but wouldn't they all be dealt with in a build-up to the great referendum?
Well, my point, David, is this. Once you get a referendum, the moment you start to hold it, the proposition is fixed. It can't be changed. It's that or nothing. Real politics is about negotiation, trade-off, compromise, debate. It's, you know, representative democracy is flexible enough to deal with all these things. Now, you say, Shane, rightly, that independence is not at the moment popular in Scotland, even though they've got a nationalist government, but it's a nationalist minority government. My view is that if the Scottish National Party got an outright majority in the Scottish Parliament, that would be the mandate for them to pursue independence. I don't think they'll get that majority, but if they did, that would be sufficient mandate, and then you could get into the negotiations of what independence really mean. Holding a referendum creates an artificial, non-negotiable simplicity around complex issues.
I would disagree with that. I think there are very clear examples where referendums aren't right because the issue is very complicated. If we talked, for example, about changing the way people actually vote, whether it should be a first-past-the-post system versus proportional representation, that's an issue that's so inherently complicated that you simply couldn't put it to referendum. Framing the question that you would ask the people would be impossible, essentially, to get any kind of meaningful result. However, something like independence, where the Scottish National Party themselves have already laid out 4 very clear types of independence: full independence, a more limited, sort of basically more powers coming from the Parliament in Westminster up to Scotland. There are ways that you can do it that simplifies it and enables people to have a democratic choice and a right to have their say heard when the matters are of fundamental importance to them, and that's the issue here.
We haven't got time for a referendum on referenda, but that, I guess, would be the obvious solution. Thank you both very much indeed. In a minute, I'll be talking to Hollywood actress Juliette Lewis. Well, not just actress. That's after the break.